I'm Bryan Fenley, and welcome to a brand new edition of our SVG Hazelden Betty Ford series, Families in Recovery. Today's topic, treatment, what really happens. And today's conversation is going to be led by Carrie Bates. Of course, she is a three-time Olympic gold medalist in swimming, currently the senior outreach manager at Hazelden Betty Ford, and she is also a Betty Ford alum. Carrie, what a guest we have today.
That's right, Brian. Today, we are so honored to have Dr. Joseph Lee with us, President and CEO of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on.
You know, our listeners to these segments, the people we're really addressing, are really interested to know more about recovery and treatment in particular. As I reflect back on my own story at the Betty Ford Center, one of the very first things I remember learning about was the disease concept, the complex nature of the disease of addiction. Can you talk a little bit about what our patients learn about the addiction model while they're in treatment?
Yeah, they learn quite a bit. But the first stage in engaging a person who needs help with a substance use disorder or addiction, as we say in conversation, is to really provide an on ramp that has dignity and affection and compassion. And this is important before their ears really open and they can hear the science of the disease that they have. Lots of people, when they are going through acute, really severe addiction in particular, lots of things happen. DUIs, conflicts within the family, problems at their jobs, and intuitively they're good people and they tend to wear this internally. They have a lot of shame about their use. They want to try to explain it away. Sometimes they blame it on various things, but they're not very happy and they know they're not their best selves. And so the first thing to do really is to show openly and explicitly an inclusiveness, a love, a compassion for them so that they know that other people have been through their journey and that they are not alone. Then, once they come to a dignified setting and they're treated like real people and their past isn't held against them in some way, we explain to them that this is not your fault. Your brain is just a little bit different, and the circumstances of your life and maybe things that have happened to you, like trauma or mental health conditions, have also affected your trajectory. And we teach them that their brain may be a little more sensitive to reward, and that over time, that translates into behaviors of repeated use and a lot of anguish that occurs in their life. And we start to unpackage that. And what that does for people is it disarms the shame, it disarms the defensiveness, it allows them to have empathy for themselves and the people around them, and allows them to connect. You know, as we say a lot at Hazelden Betty Ford, people suffer in isolation and they heal together.
You know, I really love that you talk about the guilt and shame piece. And part of my journey and in learning more about the disease itself really did start that beginning stage of lifting some of that really toxic shame and guilt that I felt. And another thing that we really focused on in treatment that I found so valuable is we started to really uncover the wreckage and the damage that this disease leaves behind, not just for us as the patient, but really looking at the entire family system. Can you talk a little bit about how we begin to unravel that wreckage and really start to reconcile with it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pain and trauma that people go through when they come to treatment because we live in systems, right? As people, we are social creatures, and we believe that addiction is a family disease. It affects generations above you, it affects generations below you. Many people with addiction actually have been affected by addiction in generations before them. They grow up in families where there's been addiction or a risk to addiction. They grow up in families with trauma or other things that happen that scar them in a particular way. And they're horrified sometimes in their own addiction when they find that they're replaying or living out some of the things that they promised they would avoid as a child. And that's just one example. And so when you look at a person's recovery and you believe in healing through addiction, empathy and connection, you look at the whole system and you help them with the science of understanding their disease. And then you help them by letting them know that they're not defined by what happened in the midst of their addiction. And you give them a language and you give them tools and you give them a perspective. But you also work on the other side of the aisle. You work with the people who love them, who also blame themselves, may have a lot of anger, who've also been traumatized. And they take steps together independently, but also together in this healing journey. And then over time, trust starts to build, the love comes forth, and what can be a real tragedy in a family, what can be a disease that tears families apart, can actually in recovery become the rallying point for that family. And we see that all the time.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you talking about the genetic predisposition and the repeat of family trauma. I know for me that was part of my journey. So one of the most crucial parts of my journey through the Betty Ford Center was the tools and resources that were provided to me as I began to prepare to go home. A very daunting part of our treatment experience, right? As we begin to have to go home to face the wreckage of our past and really start to change our behaviors in order to stop repeating that family history. Can you talk a little bit about those tools and how we set up people for their departure to go home?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that people need in terms of tools, and I love the use of that term because they need a toolkit to go home. Because in order to interact with their home environment, and again, I'll back up a little bit. Some people engage in treatment just through outpatient care. So there's many different kinds of treatment. You can get it through telehealth. You can start with your primary care doctor. You can go through treatment at inpatient settings or outpatient settings and everything in between. So there's lots of options for people. But wherever you start, once you start to have some insight that there's some changes that need to be made, and it revolves around your use patterns and how you want to use and how you want to connect with people, you also need skills. It's just not an awareness. You have to know, what are the triggers that caused you to return to drinking, for example. What are the stressors in your life you need to remove? Maybe there's depression or anxiety or ADHD or other things in the past. Maybe there's trauma that you have to unpackage, and maybe you need to own that narrative and empower yourself in a different way for you to have the confidence to know that you can be in a triggering situation or a difficult situation closer to home, and make it, and go through day by day, one day at a time, in your recovery journey. And so this toolkit is what we talk about in treatment. In science, we call it, a functional analysis. You do a timeline of what caused what, and you help them with alternative ways of living a healthy life, appreciating themselves and their family differently. You help with mental health symptoms. You help with withdrawal. You help with cravings. You help to prevent overdose. And again, the entire family goes through that toolkit journey. So ideally, you want everybody involved. You want the children to know that it's not their fault. You want the family members to know that the addiction does not represent the person that they love, that the person that they love is still in there, and the best is still ahead for their family. And so when you think about a toolkit, the word they use in science is recovery capital. And recovery capital basically means all the things within a person and outside that person that help that person in the recovery journey stay sober. And those are the things that we try to amplify in treatment. And when people get to a certain threshold, yeah, we allow them to just, hey, if you think you're ready for the next step, let's go. And we meet them where they're at, and they continue their journey. And oftentimes it is a long-term engagement with a lot of success.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing your expertise. It's not lost on me that as a patient only 10 years ago, that I would be sitting here just 10 years later, interviewing our president and CEO of the very place that saved my life. So thank you for your expertise, and thank you for sharing the hope of recovery, not just for us as patients, but really for our entire families. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Carrie, for what you do and in this moment. We're an organization of stories that inspire people. And your story is so inspirational because there are other people who, because of their jobs or their status or what they've gone through in life, are scared and they have a lot of shame. And your story empowers people to break down those walls and find love and support with other people, millions of other people in the country who found the same kind of healing and recovery. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
And many thanks again to Dr. Lee and Carrie Bates for their priceless conversation. Those two and so many others have been so helpful to so many in our industry. Hey, don't forget, we've got more on the series coming up, including the great Jerry Moe. You've seen him as a regular on this series. He has a conversation coming up with Susan Ford Bales, the daughter of Betty Ford. You are not going to want to miss this. Until then, bye for now. I'm Bryan Fenley.